Hi everyone, happy Friday. I am attorney Lilian from Lily Legal, where we help our clients get status for themselves and their families using the US immigration law system. So today I want to talk to you about a new update on interviews for removal of conditions. So these are people that either have a 2-year green card, and now they're applying to get the 10-year green card. So there was a conditional green card. Now they want to get an unconditional one, the permanent one. And the update on the interviews. Okay, that's what we're going to be talking about today. If you want to schedule a time to speak with me personally, you can do that by going to my website, lilylegal.com, or by calling my office at 508-443-1788. And of course, as always, all my contact information is in the description to this video. So let's get right into this. This is such an exciting update that I didn't want to wait. Okay, I did not want to wait to share this with you. So basically, if you don't know, if you are filing for your spouse and you and your spouse, at the day that your green card is approved, the day that your residency is approved, if your marriage is less than 2 years old, you are only getting a 2-year conditional permanent residency. Okay, that's what you're going to get, a conditional permanent residency. It lasts for 2 years, and then you need to apply to remove that condition through Form I-751. Okay, and in most situations, for to remove the condition, you have to go for an interview. There are situations where officers were willing to waive interviews, but there were few and far between. Okay, and they did not have a lot of leeway to decide cases without an interview. Well, USCIS just updated their guidelines, and they have given USCIS officers even more leeway and guidance on how and when to waive interviews. So that's what I'm going to be discussing with you today, and what they're looking for when they decide to waive the interview, because it's really important. It's really important that you pay attention to how they're making these decisions, because it really all comes down to how you file your conditional residency, how you file to remove the condition. Okay, how much evidence you present really matters. So that packet going out needs to be strong, for you to meet some of these conditions. Okay, so the first condition, or the first reason that an officer can waive an interview, is if the officer considers, you know, the officer considers that they can make a decision on your petition based on the record. So the record is whatever is in your immigration file plus whatever you filed for your removal of condition. So your initial application, everything that's in there, plus the additional documentation you sent in for your removal of condition application. That's what the officer is going to be looking at. That is the record. Okay. Anything outside of that is not part of the record. So if the officer gets your file in their office, and they look at what you filed, what was already in your file, and they decide, oh, the record is strong, then they can make a decision to waive the interview. Now, must contain the record must contain sufficient evidence about the bona fides of the marriage. So that means the record has to contain enough documentation, enough evidence for the officer to determine that this marriage is real. Okay, this marriage was not entered into for immigration benefits. And if the officer can do that, that's part one, right? And they have to also determine the marriage is real. Great. The second thing is the marriage was not entered into for immigration benefits. Okay, there's no fraud. You did not marry this person just for immigration benefits. And if the officer can basically make that decision by just looking at your file, looking at what you filed, your previous application, your current application, and they can make that determination that one, your marriage is real, and two, you did not marry this person just to get immigration benefits, they are allowed to waive the interview. Okay, so waiving the interview means less time waiting for that 10-year green card. It means you don't have to go to a USCIS office and have to go through another interview, like your first interview. Okay, so that's the first criteria, right? The officer can look at the record and determine that one, your marriage is real, and two, you did not enter this marriage for immigration purposes. The second one is there is sufficient evidence in the record. Again, if they're waiving the interview, that means they are basing their decision on the record. And again, the record is your file, right? The file that the USCIS officer gets on you, the documents that you filed for your removal of condition, the initial documents that you filed, anything that USCIS has on you, US immigration, whether you came to the US through the embassy or whatever they have on you, that's part of the record. And they are going to be making this decision based on that record. So, again, it's really important that you make sure your record is as strong as possible, which again just means when you're filing to remove that condition, that it is the strongest it can be for the officer to look at your documents and be like, you know what? This marriage looks real, seems real, and it doesn't look like this is just for immigration benefits. So I'm going to go ahead and approve it without an interview. So everything that I'm saying is going to be based on the records, on your record. So you want to make sure that your record is strong. So remember, the officer, if there's sufficient evidence in your record that the conditional permanent residence eligibility for waiver of the joint filing requirements. So when you're filing to remove the condition, you're either filing jointly with your spouse or you're filing for a waiver. This is where your spouse is not involved to remove that condition. So that can be either divorce, death, abuse, right? So if you are in that situation and the officer can look at your record and see that you meet the requirements for the waiver, well, that's another check mark on the officer being able to waive your interview. So remember, you have to show that your marriage is real. You didn't enter into it just for immigration benefits. And two, if you are filing for a waiver, the officer has to look at your records and see that you presented enough evidence, enough documentation for the officer to be able to approve it without an interview, right? You presented enough documentation of the abuse, you presented enough documentation to show that you two are legally divorced, or that your spouse passed away. Those are the requirements you have to meet. So if your record, your file shows that you meet these requirements, that's another check mark that the officer can put in to say, oh, okay, I can approve this without meeting this person, without asking them a bunch of questions. Okay, so the next thing is there is no indication of fraud or misrepresentation on your application or the supporting documentation or anywhere else in your record. Okay, so not only do you have to show that you entered into the marriage in good faith, not only do you have to show that you did not enter into the marriage just for immigration benefits, not only do you have to show that if you are applying for a waiver, that you qualify for the waiver, you also, your record, again, this is so you do not have to have an interview. Your record has to show that there's no fraud or misrepresentation, either in the forms that you filed for your removal of condition, the supporting documentation that you filed in for your removal of condition, or in anything else that's in your record. So the officer is not looking just at your removal of condition application to determine whether there is fraud or misrepresentation. They are looking at your entire file. So I tell people this all the time. You get about one immigration file, okay? Every time you go to your interview, right? A conditional permanent resident will most likely have 3 interviews, right? The initial one to get the conditional permanent residency, the interview to remove the residency, right? To remove the condition on the residency, and then citizenship if they apply for that. So every time you are applying for immigration benefits, it is going in your A file. It is going in one file, and every time you go to your initial interview to get the conditional resident, the officer has your file with everything else that's ever been filed by you, for you, anything is in there, plus the one you filed to get your conditional residency. And then when you go to your conditional residency interview, the officer, the file they have is everything else you've previously filed, plus the conditional, the application to remove the condition, plus supporting documents. When you go to your citizenship application, when you do your citizenship application, the officer gets all of the previous records, right? Everything you filed previously or that was filed for you previously, plus your citizenship application. So you really get one file. The officer gets to see everything, looks at every single thing, and then makes the decision of whether you meet the requirements. And they are allowed to look at every single application you have ever filed or that has been filed on your behalf to see if there was fraud or misrepresentation. Because sometimes I talk about this a lot, people will apply to come to the US for visiting, and they will fail to include a child on their application. A child that they know that they have, they will fail to include that child. Or they will say that they're married when they're not actually married because they think that will help them get the visitor visa, right? So if the officer is going through your file and they see that visa application, and then they're looking at your current application, and now you're showing that you had a child when you filed your visa application, but you didn't include that child, that's misrepresentation. And that can come back when you're filing to remove the condition or when you're filing for any other immigration benefit like citizenship and hunt you. So it's really important that you know what's in your record and that when you're filing to remove the condition, that your record is strong. Okay, because you want to basically any doubt that the officer could potentially have about your relationship, you want to give them documentation to alleviate all that concern, right? If the officer is thinking, I wonder if these two people live together, you want to provide evidence that you two live together so the officer can basically be like, you know what? The record already shows that they live together. There's all this documentation that they live together. Do I really need to have them come in for an interview just to decide that they live together? Okay. So whatever it is, like I tell my clients, there's certain things you need to have um, for the officer to determine that your marriage is real, especially if you've been married for 2 years. There's more expectation on documents. Okay. If you've had your green card for 2 years, you've had your social security number, the officer is expecting to see that you and your spouse are filing taxes together. They're expecting to see that you have a joint bank account for your household. They're expecting to see that you have insurance, car insurance, health insurance together, right? So there's certain expectations that they have, and you want to provide those in documentation so that you can build up your record. And again, you want to make sure that you know what's on your record, what has been filed for you, what you have filed, so that you are not contradicting yourself and potentially causing the need for an interview when really there shouldn't be an interview in your situation. Okay. Now, the next thing is there are no complex facts or issues that require an interview or sworn statement to reserve the question or concern. What does this really mean? It means that when the officer looks at your file, there's nothing that jumps out at them that seems like, I may need to interview these people because I don't understand the situation here. So, an example of this is if, let's say, when you filed your conditional permanent residency, you didn't have a child, and then when you're filing your removal of condition, you are listing a child, but the child, there's no, and you include the birth certificate of the child, and it's clear from the birth certificate that the child is not your spouse's child, right? But the child was had during the marriage. In those situations, the officer is most definitely going to want an interview, because you have to explain, how did you have a child outside of your marriage, but you want me to believe that your marriage is real and you two are building a life together, right? So the officer is going to have questions. And that's just what it is. So if there's things in your record or in your filing that seems complex, that seems like, even if it's like things that you may not see as an issue, but us immigration lawyers, we know we can usually tell you when something is going to be an issue. For example, if there's a big chunk of time where you are showing that you're in another state while your spouse is living in a completely different state, that's going to require an interview, because explain, please, how you are still in a marital relationship and you're living in two separate states. Okay, so it's not really, sometimes it's not things that we think about as complex, but for officers, if they have questions about certain facts in your case, that they can really only understand by asking you questions, then you're going to have an interview. That's just what this is saying. Okay, if there's nothing complex, if you and your spouse, if you got your conditional residency, you and your spouse have lived together, you have documentation of that, you've been building a life together, you've even had children together in the meantime, there's really nothing complex going on, there's no issues that need a little questions, then the officer can go ahead and consider your application based on the record and make a decision without ever interviewing you. Now, the next thing is there are no criminal bars rendering the conditional permanent resident removable. So that means if you have any criminal history that could make you removable from the US, you are getting an interview. That's just what that means. If you have let's be honest. If you have a criminal history, most of the time the officer is going to go ahead and schedule you for an interview because they want to ask you about it. Okay, they want to ask you about it, they want to, they may have seen the docket sheets, but if the docket sheet doesn't clearly show that the charges were dismissed, or that the charges do not make you removable or inadmissible, the officer can go ahead and approve it. But if it's not clear to the officer, then guess what? You're going to have an interview. So the officer has to basically go through all of these things and determine if you meet these requirements. And if you do, the officer is allowed to go ahead and approve your case without an interview. Will the officer deny your case without an interview? Most of the time, no. Right? They don't outright deny your application. They may send you a notice of intent to deny with the reasons why. They may send you a request for evidence asking for more documentation on a specific issue. I can tell you that one of my clients, they wanted more documentation on their marriage, which we sent a lot to start with, but they wanted more. And guess what? I'm like, we started off sending some months of bank statements. However, they wanted more documentation. So we sent everything. We printed 2 years, no, 3 years of tax returns, 3 years of bank statements, every single month of bank statements. Okay. We didn't do every other month or no. Nope, we did every single month of bank statements, which was thick. And my client actually laughed when we went to his interview for citizenship, because the interview for the removal of condition was waived. When we went to his interview for citizenship, the officer actually broke the file into two separate files because it was so thick, and it's because they wanted so much documentation. They wanted more documentation of the relationship, so we sent them every single thing that we could possibly think of, have in our possession. We sent it. So when we went in there and there's like two huge files on the desk, afterwards my client was just like, I thought something was wrong. Like, why was the file so thick? I'm like, remember when we send all those documents to prove that your marriage is real and you two are still living together and building a life together? That's where that came from, because you only have one file. So everything goes in your immigration file. That's the record the officer looks at when they're making decisions. So therefore, if you send in a lot of documentation, your file is going to be thicker than someone that didn't send in a lot of documentation. That's just how it works. And the officer, okay, is making these decisions based on the record, based on your file. So just know it is not, it is not just what you send in for that specific application. Is your entire file that the officer can take a look at to make a decision on whether to waive the interview or not. And the officer can waive the interview whether it's a joint petition, whether you're filing jointly with your spouse to remove the condition, or you're filing a waiver where your spouse is not involved. So waivers, again, is divorce, abuse, death. Okay. If you are filing based on a waiver, your interview can also be waived. And I can attest to this because, again, I have a client that theirs was waived after we were able to provide documentation showing that there was abuse. They did live together. They did try to build a life together, but the abuse made it impossible for them to continue because there was restraining orders and all these stuff going on. And it was approved without an interview. So it's possible to get your removal of condition case approved without an interview, even if you are not filing jointly with your spouse. And now the rules, right? The new rules specifically say that. Okay. The rules specifically say it. Whether you are filing jointly, a waiver, an individual request, it doesn't matter. The officer can go through this list and determine if you would qualify to have your your interview waived. Okay, so if the officer can make decisions based on just the record, your file, then they can go ahead and approve your case without an interview. All right, so who actually goes to an interview? If you're filing a joint petition, you and your spouse are required to show up for the interview. If you are filing a waiver, then you are the only one that's required to show up for the interview. Your spouse is not required to show up for the interview. They're not required to sign the forms, nothing. Only joint petitioners are required to have the US citizen spouse or permanent resident spouse sign the forms for the removal of condition. So this is a great thing. And how do you actually apply this, right? It's one thing for me to tell you, like, this is the criteria the officer is going to use, but the main question you probably have is, okay, how do I make sure that I meet these criteria? One, biggest one, because this will almost always require an interview, is criminal history. If you do not have any criminal history, that is great. You are doing amazing. Okay. If you do have criminal history, you want to present documentation that shows that that um, criminal record that you have does not make you inadmissible or removable, and the officer can clearly see that. So typically for my clients, not only do we present the docket sheets and all of that, we also do an analysis of the different things to show that this doesn't make this person inadmissible or removable from the US. And the officer can look on the record, right? Because we're filing these things, the officer can look at the record and decide, oh, okay, this is actually not an issue. I don't need to interview them because they have clearly shown me that this is not a problem. Okay. So that is really important. And then the next thing is you want to make sure that you put as much evidence of your relationship in your supporting documents as possible. That's what's really going to make a difference here. Because if the officer has any questions of whether your marriage is real, you're having an interview. So you want to present as much documentation, because in the officer's mind, you've had 2 years married to this person, living with this person, building a life with this person, that you should have more documentation than someone that just got married. Okay. So if that's the situation, right, there's an expectation that you will have more documents than someone that just got married, but your application is very thin, like there's nothing in there except maybe a lease agreement. That's not a lot. That's not, you're most likely going to end up having an interview, because you are not really presenting a lot of documentation that your marriage is real. You're just not. And the officer knows this. Like, they can look at it and they have an expectation of what does 2 years of marriage look like paperwork wise, right? What does that look like? Does that look like, depending on the officer, it may look like that you have a joint bank account, which almost all officers are looking for, that you have a joint bank account, that you have joint bills, joint expenses, joint responsibilities. So, for example, if you bought a house, if both your names are on the lease, if you have a joint bank account, joint credit cards, things that basically, if one of you decides to not pay, the other one is still held responsible. Yeah, that's what they are looking for. Not just, oh, we have both our names on it, but only one person is a responsible party on it. That's not going to work. Both of you have to be responsible for the bills. Okay, not just add your name to the bill, but both of you have to be equally responsible for the bill. If you've had children, that's great. Include birth certificates, include all of those things. I have a whole video where I break down like the type of documentation you should include to show that your marriage is real. So go ahead, watch that video, make a list. And just know, if you're just getting married, that there's an expectation that once you have your green card, you have your social, you don't really have an excuse anymore for why you don't have joint bank accounts, or why you're not filing your taxes jointly, or why you can't add your spouse to your health insurance, your car insurance, like those excuses that people typically have, which is, my spouse doesn't have a social, so we couldn't open a bank account together because the bank I use requires my spouse to have a social, right? So if that's your excuse when you went to your interview of why you couldn't open a joint account when you initially got your green card, now 2 years later you can't have the same excuse, because the officer knows now your spouse has a green card, they have a social, they can work. What's the reason now? Right? What is the reason that you and your spouse are not included in those documents? Because it cannot be because of the social anymore. So you have to know that that's how the officer is going to be looking at it, and you want to present as much documentation. And sometimes people think like I ask for too much, and sometimes I do, because I want to make sure that we include so many things that the officer is able to approve it without an interview, especially now that they have given them more permission to waive interviews. You really want to stack your evidence, okay, so that you can get those interviews waived. And then the other thing you want to consider is if you do not have a lot of documentation, or if there's something in there that's going to maybe require an interview, we also want to stack your application so that your interview is as short as possible. That the officer is literally having you come in, asking you questions about the things that they have questions on, and moving like right along. Okay. So you really, really want to stack your application. Pay attention to things that you may not even consider to be evidence. Um, Facebook posts, Instagram, Snapchat, all those things, TikTok. If you do TikTok together, you can include that. Okay. Sometimes people don't think about things like that as being actual part evidence. But yes, your digital life, right? Your social media life that you share with the world, um, is part of your is evidence. Because if there was a criminal case, those things can be, discoverable. So just know those things are things that you can use to your advantage to show that your marriage is real, because you two have a whole YouTube channel together where it's the two of you, both your names are on the channel, you two are posting couple videos together, and all those things. That's evidence. And we think documentation, bank statements are all of it. No, you can be creative, especially if you don't have a lot of documentation. So I've had clients that lived with the parents still 2 years later, and they don't have they don't have bills in both names because the parents are paying the bills. The mortgage is under the parents names. They're basically saving up to then move out, and sometimes they think, oh, we don't have anything. And I have to calm them down and talk about, okay, fine, you may not have those documents, but what do you actually have? Do you have social media? Do you text a lot? Do you call each other a lot? Like, what? There has to be something. And there almost always is something that we can use to show that the marriage is real. And you just have to be, when there's certain situations where you have to be creative and think outside of the box, especially with the world we live in now, that people are posting their lives more on social media or making money off of social media, that becomes kind of a job. So if that's kind of a job for you and you are doing that job with your spouse, that's evidence of your relationship. Okay, that's stuff that you can screenshot, you can download to show that you and your spouse are in a real relationship, that you are posting each other, that you are basically sharing your life as a married couple with the world. So I want you to not just think about the basic documents of bank statements, lease, mortgage, all those things. If you have it, that's great. Please include it. Okay? I'm not saying not to have it. You should have those, but to even beef up your application more, if you have other things outside of the traditional evidence, that will help you in bolstering your application. So that's what you really want to do. That's what this waiving the interview, right? Getting that interview waiver, you want to make sure that your application is strong, that you have so much documentation and evidence that the officer just doesn't need to talk to you to know that your marriage is real, right? And when it comes to when I talk about social media stuff, if you're on TikTok and, you know, you do a screenshot of you and your spouse on TikTok, and then you put your TikTok name or handle on the app, on the whatever you're sending in. Your officer, I'm just going to let you know this, okay? Your officer will most likely just type that in on TikTok and see more of your videos. And actually, you know, you can only send like screen grabs of videos, but they 99% of the time, if they have your social media handle, they will go and look you up and make sure that this is not just something you did once and, you know, sent in, but that this is actually what you and your spouse do on a consistent basis. So just know that if you're including social media information, know that the officer will most likely look you up and watch some of your videos. Okay, so pay attention to that. And if you want a waiver, go ahead and bolster your application. Pay attention to your record, which is your entire immigration file, and pay attention to your criminal history. Okay, make sure there's no misrepresentations or fraud that will lead to an interview. Again, interview does not mean that your case is going to be denied. I have to say that. But it does mean that you don't have to get up, go to an USCIS office, sit there, wait to be called, answer questions by the officer, go home, wait for an approval, and then get your card. Okay, you get to skip all that steps by bolstering your application and making it impossible for the officer not to approve you without talking to you. Okay, so that is all I have for you today. If you have any questions or comments, go ahead and put them in the comment section, and I do go back and respond to those. So, and sometimes I do a whole video based on your questions. So go ahead and do that. If you would like to schedule a time to speak with me personally, you can do that. All my contact information is in the description to this video. And as always, if you like this video, go ahead and hit the like button. If you know someone who needs to hear this, go ahead and share the video with them. And if you are watching in a place where you can subscribe and you do not want to miss any of my uploads, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. And as always, I am Lilian Chugura. I am the owner of Lily Legal, where we do immigration law and we do it well. Bye for now.